Dave, thanks. Turning to a developing story now in Fond du Lac County, where detectives found human remains during a search of a house on County Road Q while investigating a Madison stalking case. Inside that home, they also discovered what appeared to be multiple human skulls, books, documents, and memorabilia related to murders and serial killers. The suspect, Benjamin Larson, posted bond last week in Dane County and has since been bound over for trial in that stalking case. Detectives are now working with the Wisconsin Crime Lab and several other groups to determine whether the remains are real, and if they are, if they're from the modern era or are archaeological Native American remains. We'll continue to follow this story.